that like expanding the commission? Getting wider. Man, my organized. Welcome to the City of Madeira Beach Planning Commission meeting, Monday, November 2nd, 2020 at 6 p.m. in the Commission chambers. Agenda item number 1, this meeting is now called to order. Number 2, can we please have the roll?
Commissioner Gaither.
Present.
Commissioner Bartell.
Present by Zoom.
Commissioner Brooks. Present. Commissioner Kerr.
Here.
Commissioner Wyckoff.
Present.
And Commissioner Noble.
Here.
Okay. We have a quorum.
Very good, thank you. Agenda item number 3, public comment. Public participation is encouraged. If you are addressing the Planning Commission, step to the podium and state your name and address for the record. Please limit your comments to 3 minutes. And do not include any topic that is on the agenda. Public comment on the agenda items be allowed when they come up. Do we have any public comment? Any Zoom comments? Not that I've been made aware of. All right, moving on to number 4, approval of the minutes from 9/28/20's meeting and 10/19/2020's meeting. Anybody have any changes to the minutes for those 2 months?
Mr. Chairman, I believe the October 19th minutes are incomplete. I know that that's due to the technical difficulties of not having the audio available for the meeting, but there was a lot of discussion on the ordinance prior to the ultimate approval, but to move forward, but it's not reflected in the minutes.
City have a comment regarding that?
There we go. Well, as you said, the audio wasn't working. We don't take verbatim minutes, and so what we did was tried to go back as close as we could, but if you think that there are other specific issues, we would appreciate your giving us, you know, a kind of a rundown of what you recall that being, and we can bring it back to the board and verify it to add into the minutes. And then I would suggest that we do not adopt these at the moment, just go on and do the others, and then we can go back.
Is it possible just to approve these, but take a minute to reflect back on the meeting of the last meeting and put that into the current minutes? Because if not, the general public would not have an idea of what anything that was discussed.
That's what I'm saying. If you've got some, if anybody's got any notes on the specifics, I can go back and consider it as detailed as I can remember myself. But if you got any specifics beyond what was in the reports, because all of those, anything that we did get on record or turned into us or that we covered in the meeting that was in writing does get attached to the minutes. But we can go over all those again. So I can see that that you're not comfortable that they're complete, so I would suggest that we don't do those right now, that we get together and talk about what went on in the meeting and see how much we can get in there, and go ahead and review the other set that's here.
So we can approve September 28th, and then if anybody has any comments to add to the October 19th, they would just email them to the city, and then you guys would add them, and we'll approve them at the next meeting.
Yes.
Okay, can we get a motion to approve September 28th, 2020 minutes?
Yep, I'll make the motion that we approve the September 28th, 2020 minutes and table the October meeting minutes till next meeting.
I'll second that.
Okay, can we vote on that, please?
Commissioner Gaither?
Yes.
Commissioner Bartell?
Yes.
Commissioner Brooks?
Yes.
Commissioner Kerr?
Yes.
Commissioner Wykoff?
Yes.
Commissioner Noble?
Yes.
The vote is unanimous.
All right, agenda item number 5, new business. It looks like agenda item A, evaluation of the appraisal report. Does the city have some comments?
Yes, of course. The evaluation and appraisal report is something we've talked about both in training for the new members, and then we had already gone through a whole bunch of comprehensive planning procedure lectures and preparation earlier in our process. The evaluation appraisal report that is less than affectionately referred to as an EAR most of the time, is the report that analyzes where you are with your current comp plan, lists out where you're making changes and where those changes can be found and what standards you're using now. So what we do is we prepare a report that includes all of the amendments we're recommending throughout the comp plan, and that goes up to the state for review when we turn in our comp plan amendments. In this case, we'll be going through the evaluation appraisal one element at a time. We basically did that work when we recently went through the mobility element and made a lot of changes based on the facilities and what used to be the transportation element. And you remember we provided a chart that showed where things used to be and what they're called now, that sort of thing. We need to do that with each element when we prepare it for comp plan amendment. And then at the very end, after we've gone through the preparation process, we take the whole lot of them, including the full evaluation and appraisal report, to the City Commission for review, and then eventually send it up to the state and all the state agencies in the region, everybody who likes to get involved in reviewing our comp plan. The next section up is going to be the coastal element, and the reason that we're doing that section next is because the city has a grant to prepare a parallel flood analysis for the city as a whole, so it's kind of the beginnings. It's just great timing, really. We had to redo our comp plan anyway, and this will be great data and analysis that comes out of this grant that we can put into the formation of long-term policies for dealing with flooding and what kind of facilities improvements and plans we need to have for the future. So Jerry is here tonight because his group from the University of Florida secured the grant for us, and they are preparing the data and analysis, the research that goes into it.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, for the record, Jerry Murphy. So one of the other things that the evaluation and appraisal report is required to do is look at any statutory changes that have happened over the 7-year period since the last time you did it and make sure that the city complies. And the biggest change that has happened so far has been this parallel flood legislation that was adopted in 2015. And so it basically addresses your coastal management element, and that's what we'll be doing is going through the motions to make that compliant. Under the grant, we have to have a couple of workshops with the public. We proposed this grant back before COVID was even a word we knew, and so workshops have become more problematic. We've talked internally with staff, and we'll probably be doing some sort of a heavy presence on the web with a web page talking about the process that we're going through, and it'll probably be the entire year reaching out to the community through that, but again, as we're starting out with the coastal element. One of the first things that we'll be doing under the grant is a vulnerability assessment. and that's a geospatial analysis to identify and delineate areas where the populations are vulnerable to flood hazards. We'll be bringing that back hopefully in December. At your regular meeting in December, we'll tack a workshop onto that, either on the front or the back, whatever works best for you all and staff, and sort of lay out those graphics, identify these areas. And then from there, we'll be looking at adopting or developing policies to go into the comprehensive plan to address those issues. And then the final task is to, after the 2 workshops, we'll prepare a final report to DEP, who provided the money, to let them know how the process worked out and what we've done here in Madeira Beach. The other thing I wanted to let you know is that the Board of Commissioners, with regard to the level of service ordinance that you all reviewed, that has the mobility policies that we've changed from the transportation element that Linda mentioned earlier. We took that to the board, and in a meeting that had technical difficulties, so you may not have heard even if you were watching, they made minor modifications. The controversial policy regarding parking alongside the causeway was removed. The strategy addressing trying to lower speed limits down to 10 to 15 miles an hour was removed, and they modified the one about awnings and things sort of providing shading for the sidewalks to add language that required us to be in coordination with FDOT, which we would have to be anyway. So that has moved forward. They moved to transmit that to the state. We prepared the transmittal documents today, and so those will probably go out later in the week. We have 10 days after the board acted, 10 working days, so that's 2 weeks' time to get that on. So that's all moving forward, and the next thing that the board will be addressing will be mobility fees. Obviously, the mobility fees are reliant upon those level of service standards that are in the comprehensive plan. So until they're adopted in the comprehensive plan, we can't adopt anything because it wouldn't be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So that's kind of on hold. But everyone on the commission seems to be aware of that right now, and so we're in a good place. And so now we're moving in back to the EAR, and hopefully these workshops will be well participated, but we'll just have to see. Hopefully, if that doesn't work because people are reluctant to do in-person things, the website will provide an opportunity for people to engage more remotely. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
We do want to make a point that you have your comprehensive plan, and these amendments are all going to be amendments to that plan. So this is a good time for you to open the coastal elements, go through there and see what historically the city's policy has been, and prepare yourself that way for discussions. We will get you proposed amendments just as a basis to begin starting to talk about things, but then there's also, as you've seen, the opportunity for you to ask a lot of detailed questions. We encourage that. The more questions we've got and the more discussion we have on the details, the better the planning process is. And because this is not quasi-judicial, if you've got people in the community who are talking to you about that, that's fine. Encourage them to come to the meeting because, of course, it helps on the record always to have extra, more people involved in the process. But at any rate, the comp plan is your starting point because that's what we will be amending. A lot of those elements have pretty much been the same since they were first designed too, because there's not been a lot of call to change coastal elements. When the coastal element was first adopted, not only we're not talking about COVID, but it was so far back that we weren't even talking about sea level rise. This was back in the mid-'80s or late '80s when we got this one adopted. So this is definitely due for revision. We have a whole different situation. The world is a different place than it was back in '89 for sure. So keep that in mind as you're reading it, and that it's almost like reading a history lesson on what policy was before we realized we had problems. So definitely we're going to be making changes to that. Just try to be comfortable with it.
And the review that we did with the level of service standards with regard to the coastal element or any other element other than mobility was very cursory, just language that seemed awkward or things like that. Very little policy. So, There are probably policies in your coastal element that have been accomplished since they were in there, and the comprehensive plan is supposed to be a forward-looking document, so as you review that element, be thinking about, what the city's next steps need to be. Our focus will be primarily, the university's focus will be primarily on addressing the peril of flood compliance, but the coastal management element is bigger than just that. There's a lot of environmental aspects and things like that, sea turtles, manatees, that you may want to reconsider the policies that are in there now.
And some of those may be in what was
Yeah.
called the conservation policy. We did have to address sea turtles, I remember at the time was a big issue, was lighting on Gulf Boulevard, all up and down the beaches. That was something we were dealing with at the time, and also just the protection of mangroves and other growth. But I will say that the policies at the time at the state were not as protective, and so there may be policies in there that we can upgrade to give further protection. Also, there was no statewide effort, not really even much of a local effort towards developing living shorelines and the more creative engineering / environmental things that have been going on in Florida more recently, and those are things that we definitely would want to look at and things that we potentially could get grant funding to help with, especially around some of these city-owned or public-owned shore areas. So that we've been talking to our engineering consultants about that sort of thing, that we need to have that sort of thing in the policy in order for us to be able to use that. Sorry.
Very nice. Anybody have any questions or comments?
That ties into the mobility element as well.
It can, yes, and that's something that we've actually just been talking about. The county is trying to give new life to its program for the ferries. I'm sorry. That's my son. So he'll try every number he can come up with. Yes, so they've been talking about waterborne transportation as a way to tie in with other mobility forms that we have. And so, yes, it could affect that, and then also just general boating. There are all kinds of ways that all of that ties in together. And we definitely need to keep our eyes open for opportunities to tie the elements together and making sure that we don't have inconsistencies. We don't want one element that prevents us from implementing another or doesn't take advantage of another. So it's a really good point.
So we'll be going into depth on that in the next meeting?
Next meeting, we'll begin talking about that. I'll pull together, we've here locally in regards to the kind of water taxi thing, we've been through it a lot over the last couple of years, and I can get together with any information that they've been pulling together at the county. It's just recently been kicked off, like last month was the first meeting in that regard, but it's kind of tricky because in terms of something actually contributing to mobility, it would have to actually function as a people mover and be able to get you in a timely manner to someplace, which hasn't been the case with the water taxi here. It didn't have enough stops, and it took so long to make the round that it wasn't really contributing to an actual mobility service. That was part of the problem, and that's the same problem they've had in most places. It's successful at Clearwater, to the Clearwater Beach, because they run a loop and have short turnarounds for it, just like a bus. And that's kind of what you have to get to before you can really rely on it to pick up part of your transportation and mobility function or service. So previously, the city commission here had been subsidizing the water taxi every year, anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000, and they had decided a couple of years ago they weren't going to do that anymore because there wasn't enough ridership, and it really didn't get people. It was kind of a sightseeing tour, but didn't really contribute to, as a water taxi, to get you anyplace quickly. So, but that's something that always is going to come up again, I think. You know, they've had a big interest in getting it going. They kind of sidelined it when they didn't have the commission's support anymore because the commission was picking up a big portion of the budget. And sometimes that's a difficult decision for a city to make, because when you start out something new like that, you usually do publicly invest in it pretty heavy up front to get it working, because it's hard to get enough of it going to show a return. In transportation, it's probably never going to show an actual return. Like, it's not going to be a profitable thing, but just to make it usable enough for locals that it's really contributing to mobility.
Well, I'm just thinking, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but with the plan, with the Duane plan, and considering changes in parking when you first enter the city limits,
Yes.
and then the transportation element down to Johns Pass Village or any place you want to take those tourists, that could be something that all ties together. It may not have been a need for it prior to having the parking when you first come in. But bigger than that, I was really considering how your study would impact land transportation with the problems that we have with the flooding coming up through the streets.
Yes.
And that being stormwater, but then having the tidal surges. And I just think that we need to consider separation of those two factors, and I won't go into depth on that now, but I think that's got to be a big part of what we look at.
That's a lot of the flooding information that we'll be undertaking with the coastal review, yes. That's the kind of data we do need to collect a lot of data on how well the facilities are functioning, what are the circumstances under which they'll stop functioning, or, you know, project out what's the timeline, and are there repairs or changes we could make in the future to push that off or to avoid it. That's all a part of the review they're doing. And we're also looking at some other grant opportunities that would build on top of that. There are some grants that you typically get subsequent to this level of grant application. So, you know, it tries to move you through the process of inventorying your public facilities, looking at your options down the line, making plans for the future. So at each step, hopefully we can get some assistance from the state to help fund that. It's really hard for local governments to get into the depth of data review. We need to create plans of that level of detail. It's a big threat for us because, you know, we do not have a very big budget.
Oh, we'll have an opportunity to have input into the study.
Yes, yes. And the other engineering grants that we've been looking at are actually in cooperation with or being granted through the Public Works Department. We're looking at coordinating every way we can. Also with working where it's possible with Treasure Island. Sometimes if you go in with a study with another group, it helps, another grantee that it helps strengthen your application. So we've also been coordinating with them to see what our options would be there.
Do you have a schedule when the workshops are going to be yet, or so we can start letting people know? Or
we are actually trying to develop a schedule that includes the entire process. It's really complex. So we've been working on it for about a week and a half now, but we're all going to sit down and look at it again because I want to make sure we've got everything in there. It actually has to include things like when we advertise and what type of advertisement, because all of these things require different types of advertisement than the city normally does, and you don't want to mess it up, as you've seen, because it's expensive. So throughout this process, we have to have a really good grip on what our process is, which level of review we're at, where the advertisement has to go, how long we have to send it off to the state afterwards. There's all kinds of requirements. So we'll come back, and I'm not sure you're going to want to look at it, but there's going to be a substantial grid to show you what to expect over.
So we'll probably have something like that at the next meeting.
Yeah.
There won't be any of these workshops that anybody needs to go to over, like, for November.
No.
Okay, just,
Otherwise, well, actually, as soon as we get the schedule set up, I'll get it out to you. I'll email it to you, because I think it helps as soon as you know to look long-term,
okay.
you know,
That
what the
works.
process is going to be and be able to see how it all comes together. It seems like a long time, because we're talking about a year and a half worth of work, but as you've seen, it takes quite a bit to get through each separate element of this, and we have layers and layers to go through each time. So I'll get that out as soon as we can. Hopefully we'll finish that up this week.
Okay, great. Anybody else with comments? Do we have to hear from the public? Is there any public? Any Zoom? Okay, then, we're moving on to agenda item number 6, old business. A, election of officers.
Sir, the charter requires you to elect officers in October. You were unable to do that last month, so we need to move forward with that process. Tamara, are you ready with that? You would have to call the vote on each time, so we'd be open to open up the various chairs. And what we have is the chair and 2 vice chair.
And before, didn't we just take motions, like someone would
Yeah,
make a
somebody
motion and then we voted on it?
Somebody can nominate someone, and then if
Okay.
they accept the nomination, you can go ahead and hold the vote. I would suggest that you start with chair, since
Okay,
a person may want to be chair but not risk not wanting to be something else if they have the opportunity. So I would suggest chair.
do we have any nominations or motions?
I'll nominate Mr. Noble.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
Sure.
Excellent. Can we have a vote?
Linda,
Yes.
do the people who were elected vote too?
Yes.
Okay. All right, sorry. Commissioner Gaither?
Yes.
Commissioner Bartels?
Yes.
Commissioner Brooks?
Yes.
Commissioner Kerr?
Yes.
Commissioner Wykoff?
Yes.
And Commissioner Noble?
Yes, thank you. Smiling under my mask.
The vote-
Nice. You ran a
the vote
clean
is
race.
unanimous.
You ran a clean race.
That's good. It's only a problem if you're elected to something you're not smiling about.
Yes. Okay, well, moving on, I guess, first vice chair,
Yes.
and I believe it's Mike now.
Correct.
And
I'd like to nominate
I would,
Chairman, Commissioner Wykoff as first chair. I'll second that.
Who seconded? Okay, thank you.
and we'll go to the vote.
Commissioner Gaither?
Yes.
Commissioner Bartels?
Yes.
Commissioner Brooks?
Yes.
Commissioner Kerr?
Yes.
Commissioner Wykoff?
Sure.
And Commissioner Noble?
Yes.
The vote is unanimous.
And the second vice chair.
Yeah, this had previously been Robin, and so this is an open chair
Okay,
position.
Well, any volunteers?
do we, yeah, I was gonna say, who's been on the longest,
How
or
about,
is anybody?
Mr. Kerr, I'd like to nominate Mr. Kerr.
I can tell you. who's been on.
Okay. I
I'll
would
second
say-
that.
Okay. Did you get those?
There was nomination by Gaither and a second by Brooks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can we go to the vote?
I'm sorry, I missed it. I missed the.
Oh.
Gaither first, and motion, and Brooks second.
For,
Or Kerr.
Commissioner Gaither?
Yes.
Commissioner Bartels?
Yes.
Commissioner Brooks?
Yes.
Commissioner Kerr?
Yes.
Commissioner Wykoff?
Yes.
Commissioner Noble?
Yes.
The vote passes unanimously.
And I believe that's all three. Any others that we're missing?
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Moving on to agenda item number 7, administrative staff presentation. And it looks like A, presentation by Linda, Community Development Director on floodplain management, Robert's Rules, and administrative procedure. The
Yes,
microphone's yours.
thank you. I did want to give you the opportunity to get a quick briefing on floodplain management, because I think that those questions about floodplain management, how is it's administered, comes up as we have especially quasi-judicial proceedings, but also as we go through comprehensive planning and we start talking about coastal or conservation issues and about land use. You're going to need to understand that, and we'll make sure that everybody has an up-to-date copy of the floodplain ordinance. Typically, the floodplain ordinance is updated at least annually because things change all the time and the requirements that we have change. The city is a part of the National Flood Insurance Protection Program, and as such, because we are a member of the program and participate in it, property owners get a discount on their flood insurance. And the level of flood insurance discount we get is based on how well we are ranked within the community rating service. That is largely administered by the insurance service officers who are consultants to FEMA. Now, I think it's really important to keep in mind, and I know Commissioner Kerr and I have had these conversations, it's really important to keep in mind in all of this, the establishment of the floodplain map and any other aspects of National Flood Insurance Program is exactly that. It's an insurance program. And so what they're assessing is what is the real risk to the value of your property. So we have a floodplain ordinance that deals with all the aspects that our state has determined are appropriate within an ordinance. We can and do have things in our ordinance that are a little stricter than the absolute requirement. And the reason for that is we're trying to make sure that we are protecting the standing we have in the CRS, our rating. Recently, we have every 5 years or so to go through a ratings review, and recently we went to a rating review that included not 5 years, but 8 years back. And we ended up being downgraded instead of upgraded, as we had expected, partially because the ISO group that reviewed it were taking points away for things that was happening 8 years back based on current standards, which is not good because current standards are much heavier than they were 8 years ago. So we're in the process of appealing that, and FEMA had agreed to review our submission again to see if we can get back to our level 6. With a level 6, the community had a 20% discount on their flood insurance. Right now we're at a 7 and you have a 15%, so we want to get back to the 6 at the very least if we can. The management of that CRS program is monstrous, and we've gotten to the point where you need at least one FTE just to keep track of all the data. We have to review every plan that comes in, check to see what, if it's a home, it's residential use, whether it's residential or commercial, we have to do all buildings the same, but basically we have to look at their floodplain level. That would be the 100-year floodplain, where the 100-year flood would hit that building. And it depends where you are on the island. You may be at a 10-foot flood, or you may have a 15-foot flood. We have to check to see if it's in the velocity zone, which is the area on the beach where the waves add to the impact of the flood and the velocity hitting the building, because of course that has an effect on how high you want the floors, what building type and structures you need to have, and what you're allowed to do underneath that level. And then we have to check to make sure they aren't bringing too much fill onto the site, because you don't want people raising their yards way up. It creates new flooding hazards for the properties on either side of it. We have to review things like how high the seawall is, how well the lots are all draining so that people aren't changing the grading on their property and thereby draining off onto their neighbors and flooding them, even just regular rain, not just when there's a big flood. We have to look to make sure that all the electrical equipment in the building is designed properly so that all kinds of facilities and services are above that level, that they have adequate square inch of flood vents in the building to keep the walls from collapsing, because walls will collapse in as little as 2 feet of water. Cars can float in a foot and a half of water. I think that a car can float, and you know, cars floating in your garage up against your walls is not a great thing. But floating outside against somebody else's wall is not a good thing either. So there's all kinds of things that we have to look at. Other things that go on in the yard and how big they are, how well they're anchored, everything has to be anchored and evaluated. So it's a huge permitting and regulation effort. But then on top of that, we have to collect all kinds of data every year about how we are maintaining our drainage facilities, stormwater systems, what kind of measures we're doing in our code to make sure yards are not flooding or that we're not changing elevations, how we're maintaining the seawall, the mobility issues. Commercial buildings have to be regulated differently. They're allowed to flood-proof, so we have to look at all the systems for flood-proofing in the A zone. In the V zone, they have different requirements altogether for both residential and commercial. There's a whole lot that goes into this. And then we also have a huge responsibility for community outreach. So you may notice that recently you got a letter. If you didn't get it, you will. In the mail, we just did a bulk mailing where we have to put out information on a whole bunch of different topics. This year we developed a brochure that covers a whole bunch of those topics all in one spot. I also send out a letter every year reminding people what the insurance requirements and opportunities are, and give them the opportunity to get in touch with us, tell them whether they can get additional information on their property and on insurance generally. And then we have to have public meetings, regular outreach by mail, regular outreach by other forms of social media. And then we have to document all of that. And then at this point, we also have to document our participation in county programs, including the realtors' education they give on floodplain management every year. We have participated in that sort of thing. Any community meetings the county's having, massive mail-outs in the utility mail-out. You'll notice in your utility bill at least once a year you get information on flood management. And the landscaping people, the insurance people, we have to participate in those public education programs. So all of this has to be documented, and it has to be documented in a particular format in order for us to get credit. And then they'll decide how much of a credit they give you for it. That's why you never know what your rating is until you've been through a real review. But we have to do an annual report. It takes us a couple months to produce every year. And then on top of it, the 5-year report, which is exhaustive and involves a couple thousand different types of documents to submit. Keeping track of all of this is what we do in our spare time. And so we're always really careful. When we do a permitting on any kind of a building and somebody's made a change, and this happens all the time, people will come in and we'll discover that they've already made big changes to their building, and they weren't allowed to do that. There have been several buildings around town you may have seen demolished over the years. People will come in and start gutting their building out. The flood insurance program requires that you are not allowed to, in what's called a pre-firm house, a house that's not built above the floodplain, you're not allowed to improve the house more than 50% of the value of that house in a certain time frame. In our case, we still have a 1-year or a 12-month, rolling 12-month process for that. Some places have expanded. You're only allowed to do it every 2 years or even every 5 years because they're trying to beef up their program or they have more endangered repetitive loss houses than we do. But sometimes people will come in and they've gutted out the whole house before they get a permit. That's never a good idea. And then when we sit down to evaluate what it's going to cost to make it livable again, just livable, not high-end, but just livable, it costs more than 50% of the value of the house. Because, you know, we got a lot of houses around that are very small and don't have a lot of value according to their property appraised value. If they've already done that, we can't go back and have them get a private appraisal. If you had, you know, if we know ahead of time that there's not enough value in the property appraiser's value, then we'll tell people, go get a private one, we can't accept that. But if they've already gutted it, we're not allowed to do that. You have to take the value of the home as assessed the day before any work began, and a private appraiser can't go back and project what it was. So in those cases, we've had to have people tear their house down. That's heartbreaking. If somebody comes in and they want to do a big project that's over 50% of their value, we'll sit down with them and figure out what they can do given the amount that they've got to work with, and make sure that each of the projects leaves the house in a occupiable condition, and then they can come back the next year and do a different project. Of course, at that point, the house's value would have been increased if they got a private appraisal because they made some investment the year before. We can't do projects that are staged. It cannot look like a single project is phased for this. You can't gut it all out and then come back, or then ask for, it has to be occupied. We have to get an occupiable situation. You can't just obviously stage it, like build up a structure for a second floor out of your 50% and then come back the next year and put it in, enclose it, you know. So you can't make changes to it that leave it unoccupiable when you get through using up that first 50%. So we will work with people every time to suggest these are your options. Sometimes I have to admit there's just not enough money in something. We've got tiny little structures here, some of which that by property appraisers' value have like only $30,000 to $40,000 worth of value. And you know, if you've done any construction, you know it's really difficult to put in a new kitchen, bathroom, and a new roof in half of that value. But we will let them know that. Sometimes it really is cheaper and better to tear it down and to build something that's new and above the flood level. One reason for that is not only because of the construction cost, but the value of the house afterwards, also the insurable value. The insurance rates for people who are up above the flood level on their property is just minor compared to what people are paying. I mean, it's little. We have people who have built brand new homes that are paying $300 a year for flood insurance, as compared to others who are paying several hundred a month. And it'll continue to go up because flood insurance is supposed to gradually get to market rate. So we have to be very careful about administering all that. Each time we get a big project that's a renovation completed, somebody in town complains about it to FEMA, and I spend a good deal of my time writing up explanations on exactly how I came up with the cost and verified it to meet our code, so that we don't get into hot water with FEMA, because the reason we had an 8-year cycle review this last time was because we were under investigation. FEMA can step in and determine that you have violated your own floodplain ordinance and that you've allowed things to be built above the 50%. If they find that's the case, you lose your CRS program. And if you lose your CRS program, it takes you a while to get it back. You've got to go through all kinds of special hoops and extra investment to get that back. And while you have lost CRS, that would think, okay, well, that's less money we spend in keeping up with it, you know, less frustration. But a city who does not have a CRS rating is not part of the program. No homes within that jurisdiction can receive a federally backed mortgage. The city is not eligible for any federal monies or grants. And it's pretty significant. You also would not be eligible for flood insurance. So all we need is for everybody to lose their flood insurance and everybody to lose their mortgageability, and one big storm come through and city's gone. So it's really important that we figure out how to stay on track with that. So when somebody comes in, we are really very precise, and we try to work with everybody as best we can to help them through this, but we cannot make concessions on the code and on the way that the floodplain management ordinance is administered. Now, every time something has to be reviewed for floodplain management, which is just any big project or new construction for sure, any big renovation, it has to be signed and sealed by the floodplain manager in order to move forward and to get a CO and a final building review. And the floodplain manager is me. There's only one right now in town, so I have to review everything. So we not only do all the planning review, Zane does all the planning for all the other stuff, the setbacks and everything. He helped me review for floodplain management because he's in training as a floodplain manager. He's actually taken his course or test, and we'll see soon whether he got through the exam. It's a complex exam. But at this point, you cannot move forward without approval of the floodplain manager. So we don't even issue permits unless it's already been signed and sealed. People don't get way into it and then find it's wrong. If they get way into it and we do a stop work order based on floodplains, because they're building something other than they got permitted, and that happens more often than we'd like. But we've also we're trying to set up ways now to make permitting clearer, but also to get our people out on the street more to make sure that we're keeping track on what people are doing, because if they don't call for some kind of an inspection in their construction process, they can get way down, in the weeds and too deep into trouble before they make a final call for an inspection, and then we show up and tell them, you have to rip some of it out. So we try to avoid those situations, but that's the reason why we're so careful about the floodplain program. Any questions?
Well, that's why it is important to, whenever we do have and not try to slow down the development and encourage people to build their house up, because it does benefit the entire community when, house by house, they're being built up. And we had discussion about that with the impact fees and how we don't want to, slow down residential development by those. We talked about that last week. But, I just wanted to say that it's good. Every time a house gets built up out of the floodplain, it helps everybody.
Mm-hmm. If it's taken a long time to get permitted here, it very seldom has anything to do with the regulations. It usually has to do with the fact that the plans were incomplete. We get plans in all the time that just don't have all the minimum requirements on them, things that we do have to have not only for floodplain management, but in order to fill the building code requirements. And so we'll do a list of things that are missing. We send it out, and they bring some of the things back in. So we put out the list of the missing again, and they bring some of them back in. And this goes around and around sometimes. We're trying to come up with some procedures, some of which I have had success with elsewhere, one of which is that every time we do a list of things that are missing from the plan, we send the copy to the owner, not just to the contractor, so that the owner realizes what's really going on, because they get the idea that we're holding them up when in fact it's their own contractor or their own engineer or architect doing that. So we are contacting owners on everything now. We also like to bring people in for meetings instead of just going back and forth by email or by phone, and notification is, if there's a problem, let's all get together and talk this out, because it's amazing how 15 minutes of everybody in the same room can shake things up and get them headed in the right direction. So it's hard, there aren't that many of us here, and given what I just told you about the CRS management, and then we also have an LMS, the mitigation strategy, that has not quite as much review to do, but an awful lot. We've got another program we have to review all the time. It's a lot of work for all of us to keep up with. We try to make it is user-friendly. Also, soon we'll be permitting online, and so we're going to develop a dashboard, so if you've got a permit in process, you'll be able to, go on, check your address and see exactly why your permit, where it is in the process, and if it's missing something, exactly what that is online.
Okay, moving on. Number 2?
We did do did we do a distribution on Robert's Rules, or we didn't get it yet? The Robert's Rules, we didn't get the placard yet. We're going to order, I'm trying to find like a 2-page summary of some keys on Robert's Rules just to help you out, because I know that's really complex. It's really important, especially when we're doing things like quasi-judicial hearings, how you move, I move this, or in what order you can do things in. And the chair is responsible technically for running everything, but it sure would help him a lot if everybody else knew what they were supposed to be doing too. So we're going to bring that to you. It's because it is important. These are all legal meetings that you have, and it's fairly important to help keep order with things that, we are sure we've got the right person making the motion or moving things on, that things are thoroughly voted for and appropriately documented. So we're going to get back to you with a cheat sheet. I've used it before. I used to teach parliamentary procedure, which is basically Robert's Rules. So it's really helpful to have something concise in front of you. So that is forthcoming. We just had to order them.
That would be nice.
The third item on that list was administrative procedure, and I wanted to make some explanations because I know it was difficult without me being here last week, and Zane is going to have to be brave and step up when I'm out and help give you direction. It's kind of hard when somebody's new to know exactly what the procedure is supposed to be and the history behind everything, and he doesn't have the opportunity because of our work level. Things are kind of segregated, so it's difficult for somebody to step in for me at the last minute. I was unavoidably somewhere else, and would rather have been here. But I do want to point out, like, I think one issue came up last week, or last time you met, that the minutes, you had already voted, the board had already voted on some minutes, and if after the meeting the administrative assistant had gotten your signature on it, I sure don't know what she did with it thereafter, because they were not scanned, they were not put in the file, they're just non-existent. We know they were voted on, but we're going to have to ask you to sign them again. We wouldn't ask you to do that if we had it. So Tamara does have that, but we have to always make sure, of course, that the records are complete and we do get signatures on them. So that, you know what we were going through over the course of the spring, not only with a transition in people, but COVID and having meetings, not having meetings, some people working off-site. So we really don't know what happened to those documents.
Yeah, and I did sign them when I first came in, because I reviewed, and yes, they were
the same ones.
Ones, right. They were sort of just re-signed them, and I put today's date on there. But
yeah,
I know that in the past we would do, one meeting, and then that next meeting we would have it. We wouldn't be several behind.
And I think that will be the case now.
I think so. Yeah, I agree that we'll get there. So let's try to get that going, because it makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, when we have really complex meetings, it may take us longer. And as you said, if there are things that we have to do a lot of detail on, it also has to do with how many other things have going out during the month, because the workload for this staff includes a lot more than just the assistance with the board. And the order that we proceed and the way that we administer our function comes by way of direction from the city manager through me. So this staff works for the city manager, and he can redirect us in any way. But I think that typically we would always want to have the minutes back the next meeting, and we will always endeavor to do that, but there may be occasion where we've gotten reassigned to something else. If you were here during our preparation for the CRS, we actually had points at which we didn't have a lot on the agenda, and we just couldn't even have meetings. because there was just no way, with only Jenny and I here, that we could have gotten the response out to FEMA for the CRS in time. They gave us like a 3-month window for something that normally people know about 5 years in advance. So it was both of us having hands on deck, round the clock some periods. So in cases like that, I don't see that coming up again because now we have a system. One of the things I've been trying to focus on since getting here is when we have these things that are going to come up routinely, we need a system for collecting data, filing data, where it's going to go, so that if I'm not here, somebody else can step in, find everything, put the reports together, and still be able to carry on. But there were no systems, there wasn't even data here when we got here. So it's been some effort trying to get things organized and set it up so that all of this is automatic. We'll continue working on that. If you ever have problems with the way things are being handled or the way the meetings are being conducted, especially, well, as it relates to the administration of the staff, then your comments should come directly to me, and if you've got a problem with me, to the city manager, because the staff isn't supervised by you. That's the way you have to go about doing it. We appreciate...
I know there's been some staff turnover, but also when they moved from the old building to the new building, I think they lost a lot of documents. They lost a lot of documents between city managers, I think, too. And but actually, at one point, they gained a lot of documents. You know, Treasure Island, we didn't want them, but Treasure Island was doing our permitting for a while, all the building documents. And planning and building documents, well, building you can let go over time, but planning documents have to be kept in perpetuity. We don't ever get to sift through them or burn them or destroy them. And Treasure Island had been doing the building permitting part of it, and when the city took that back over, they came down in a big truck with boxes of records and shoved them out the back onto the ground, and there was paper everywhere, and that's how we got our records back. The boxes weren't organized, things were just thrown in boxes, and it took them months to try to associate one document with the next. They did the best they could, but, you know, eventually ran out of time to do it. So now every time something pertains back to that time period, we've got to pull boxes out of records and hopefully can figure out what it's about. But a lot of it was effectively destroyed by just how poorly it was kept. It's usually best that you are, you know, responsible for your own records for those very reasons. Others don't have the same interest in your long-term well-being. Agreed.
It's unfortunate.
Sounds good.
Great.
Okay, moving on. No, nobody submitted anything for agenda item 8, Planning Commission open discussion. So then, agenda item number 9, next meeting is December 7th, 2020. Nothing under informational materials. So this meeting's adjourned. Thank you, Linda. Thanks, everybody.